Imagine a world where one wrong move could cost you everything. A world where failure on the battlefield wasn't just a career ender, but a death sentence. This was the reality for Soviet General Dmitry Pavlov, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Red Army during World War II. Today, we're diving into one of the most brutal and shocking executions of World War II, the downfall of General Pavlov. Was he a traitor, an incompetent leader, or just another victim of Stalin's iron-fisted rule? On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million Axis troops, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery, stormed into the Soviet Union in a surprise attack that shattered Stalin's illusions of peace. Despite multiple warnings from spies, diplomats, and even Winston Churchill, Stalin refused to believe that Hitler would break the non-aggression pact so soon. One of the most striking warnings came from Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy in Japan, who provided the exact date of the invasion. But Stalin dismissed it as British provocation. The result, the Red Army was caught completely off guard. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had destroyed 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them still on the ground. This gave the Nazis total air superiority, making it nearly impossible for Soviet forces to mount an organized defense. On the ground, things were even worse. The Wehrmacht's Blitzkrieg tactics, a brutal combination of speed, firepower, and coordinated attacks, ripped through Soviet defenses. Within days, the Germans had pushed deep into Soviet territory, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and cut off before they even had a chance to fight back. At the center of this chaos was General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Soviet Western Front. His troops bore the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, and the results were catastrophic. Dmitry Pavlov wasn't just another Soviet general. He was a decorated war hero, a veteran of World War I and the Russian Civil War, and a tank warfare expert. He even proved his loyalty to Stalin by fighting in the Spanish Civil War, where he saw firsthand how important armored warfare could be in the future. But in June 1941, he faced an enemy the Red Army had never encountered before: the full force of Hitler's invasion. As commander of the Western Front, Pavlov had the impossible task of stopping the Nazi war machine. Here's what most people don't know. Before the war, Pavlov had tried to modernize the Red Army's tank divisions. He recognized the importance of armored warfare and pushed for reforms. However, his efforts were hampered by Stalin's purges, which had decimated the Red Army's leadership, and by a lack of resources. When the Germans struck, Pavlov's forces were unprepared. The Germans executed a textbook encirclement maneuver, cutting off Pavlov's troops from reinforcements and supplies. Soviet commanders desperately tried to regroup, but communications were in shambles. Orders from Moscow were confusing, often contradicting the reality on the battlefield. Some Soviet units, overwhelmed and leaderless, surrendered without firing a shot. Others fought to the death, but it made little difference. Within a week, the Germans captured Minsk, a key Soviet city. By the end of June, Pavlov's forces had lost over 400,000 men, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The Western Front had effectively collapsed, marking one of the most devastating defeats in Soviet history. So, was Pavlov really to blame? That's what Stalin wanted everyone to think. But the truth is a lot more complicated. Pavlov's failures on the Western Front cannot be understood without examining the systemic issues within the Red Army and Stalin's leadership style. One of the most critical problems was Stalin's micromanagement. Despite having little military expertise, Stalin insisted on controlling every aspect of the war effort. He demanded absolute obedience from his generals, often overriding their decisions and issuing contradictory orders. For example, in the early days of the invasion, Pavlov requested permission to retreat and regroup his forces to avoid encirclement. However, Stalin, fearing the political consequences of losing territory, refused. Instead, he ordered Pavlov to hold his ground at all costs, a decision that led to the catastrophic loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Another major issue was the Red Army's outdated tactics. While Pavlov had advocated for modern mobile warfare, the Soviet military was still heavily reliant on static defenses and mass infantry assaults. This played directly into the hands of the Germans, whose blitzkrieg tactics emphasized speed, flexibility, and overwhelming firepower. Yes, Pavlov made mistakes, his forces were unprepared, and his defenses crumbled. But was he the only one at fault? Absolutely not. Stalin's arrogance and refusal to heed warnings left the Soviet Union exposed. Instead of admitting his own failure, Stalin needed a scapegoat. When all was said and done, the blame didn't rest solely on Pavlov. It was Stalin's failure too. The result was a devastating chapter in Soviet military history, drenched in blood. Before we continue, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from history's darkest corners. Stalin didn't handle military failures with patience. He handled them with blood. By 1941, he had already purged thousands of his own officers, convinced that incompetence and betrayal, not German military strength, were the real threats to the Soviet Union. After the catastrophic defeat on the Western Front, someone had to take the fall. That someone was General Dmitry Pavlov. But here's the thing, Pavlov wasn't just a failed commander. He was also outspoken, openly criticizing Soviet military strategy. He believed that Soviet tactics were outdated and had even voiced concerns about the Red Army's lack of preparation before the war began. In Stalin's world, that was as dangerous as losing a battle. Some historians believe Stalin saw him as a potential rival, not just an incompetent general. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, rivals didn't get second chances. On July 4, 1941, Pavlov and his top officers were arrested on charges of criminal incompetence and failure to execute orders. But let's be real, this wasn't a trial. It was a death sentence in disguise. The entire trial lasted just 90 minutes. There was no real evidence, no witnesses, and no defense. The verdict, guilty. The punishment, execution. Stalin had already made up his mind before the trial even began. On July 22, 1941, Pavlov was taken to a firing squad. He wasn't alone. 3 of his closest officers, Major General Vladimir Klimovsky, Chief of Staff, Major General Andrei Grigoriev, Chief of Communications, and Lieutenant General Ivan Boldin, Deputy Commander, were executed right beside him. This wasn't just about punishing failure. It was about sending a message to the rest of the Red Army: obey or die. And it worked. The fear spread quickly. Generals who had once voiced concerns about Soviet military tactics suddenly had nothing to say. Officers who had warned about weaknesses in the Red Army kept their mouths shut. Stalin made it clear, losing a battle wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. According to some accounts, Pavlov's final words were, "Tell my family I died honorably." Even in death, he remained loyal to the Soviet Union, a country that had just betrayed him. Here's the twist. Years later, after Stalin's death, the Soviet government admitted that Pavlov had been wrongly executed. In the mid-1950s, after Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, took over, the Soviet Union began exposing the dictator's brutal mistakes. Khrushchev launched a campaign to clear the names of many officers and political figures who had been falsely accused and executed during Stalin's reign. In 1957, Pavlov was officially rehabilitated, meaning the government recognized that he had been wrongly convicted. So, why did it take so long? Simple. Stalin's paranoia had rewritten history. For years, Soviet records painted Pavlov as a failure, a traitor, someone who deserved his execution. But after Stalin was gone, the truth began to emerge. Pavlov hadn't been a traitor or a coward. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, under the rule of a man who needed a scapegoat. In the end, Pavlov wasn't just a victim of war, he was a victim of Stalin's paranoia. His downfall was the result of a system that prioritized fear over fairness and power over progress. Pavlov's story is more than just a tragic chapter in World War II history. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of authoritarianism. So, what do you think? Was Pavlov a traitor, an incompetent leader, or just another victim of Stalin's iron-fisted rule? If you have evidence to argue otherwise, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from history's darkest corners. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.